The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
The 1989 Portuguese Grand Prix will forever be famous for Nigel Mansell being black flagged, failing to see that flag, then colliding with championship contender Ayrton Senna. To imagine the sort of uproar there would be if something like that happened today is a terrifying thought. But even in the days before social media and online coverage, this was a massive controversy, with Mansell being banned from the following race at Jerez. We'll get into all of that and everything else that was going on during a fascinating period of F1 as Bring Back V10s takes its latest trip back to the first year of our V10 era. Joining me, Glenn Freeman, for this one are Sam Smith and Andrew Vanderberg, two men who are very fond of this time in F1, as am I. So Andy, welcome along to your first appearance of Series 5. When you think back to Portugal 89, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, at the moment, the first thing that's coming to mind is that normally Sam and I are recording the Formula E podcast. So coming here and talking about things that happened almost 30 years ago is a bit weird. We should be talking about electric motors and the whir of a motor rather than the thundering sound of a V10 and a V12. No, but the thing that always comes to mind when I think about this race is the most perfectly executed bit of reverse parking in Formula One history. And even as soon as you sent me the email about this, I could see Mansell in the pit lane. I could see him engage in reverse in that car going backwards, because at this time in F1, you know, you'd hear that reverse was basically there to fulfill the regulations. And if someone went straight on at La Source or whatever, they could be there 3 minutes trying to hook up reverse and get back out. There's Mansell, oh, just whack it in, yeah, back up there. It's perfectly done as well, the way he just sort of puts a bit of a slide back in. So in a very long way around, that's what I always think of when I think of this Grand Prix.
Excellent plug for our Formula E podcast as well. The new Formula E season is up and running, so look for that in your podcast feeds. Sam, what sticks out for you about Portugal 89 when the cars are a bit louder than they are in Formula E?
Well, I shan't channel my inner Ed Straw and choose Roberto Moreno totaling his new Coloni C3 in practice. Although I was tempted just to annoy you, Glenn. But really, you know, in a similar vein, it's got to be that incident really between Mansell himself, his pit box, and ultimately Senna. I think the vision of Roland Brunschreider and his assistant, sort of very lackadaisically putting out a black flag, and Mansell not seeing it for 3 laps has got to be the standout memory for me.
Yeah, and we will spend a lot of time going into that because, as you can imagine, there's so much to that story. Before we get going, as ever, we'll do some shout-outs to those of you leaving us 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. Thank you to everyone who supports the show in this way, including some of our most recent reviewers, Joe G 1993, McQuirty7, Cal Rowe, and Freddie Mercury's cat, who got in touch on Twitter because Freddie's cat doesn't listen on Apple Podcasts. Talking of Twitter, though, make sure you use the hashtag BringBackV10s to get your questions in about anything to do with F1 from 1989 to 2005 for our series finale episodes. Or you can email them to bringbackv10s@the-race.com. And remember, if you want to get early access to ad-free versions of the show, plus bonus content between series, check out the Race Members Club. To find out more about all the other benefits you can get and to sign up, head to the-race.com/members club. But back all the way to 1989, and as ever, you didn't have to look very far to find an Ayrton Senna Alain Prost controversy heading into this weekend, although this one was more of an issue between Prost, McLaren and Honda. Honda demanded an apology from Prost after he hinted that he didn't think he was getting fair treatment on the engine side at the previous race at Monza. We'll save a deeper look at that for a Monza 89 episode in the future, but we will deal with the fallout. Former McLaren team manager Joe Ramirez has said that Honda refused to keep supplying Prost with engines for the rest of the season if they didn't get an apology, and Prost had to put together a letter with team boss Ron Dennis to fix it. Once it was resolved, McLaren and Honda released a statement saying they had reassured Prost to his satisfaction that he was getting equal treatment with Senna, even though by now it was known that Prost was going to Ferrari for 1990. The statement added, "Alain deeply regrets the adverse publicity and the resulting embarrassment that has been caused by his actions. Honda and McLaren have accepted that these resulted from Alain's perception of his treatment by the team and were not made with malicious intent. He has agreed that in future any doubts he might have about the parity or performance of his car will be discussed with the relevant engineers prior to the comments being made in the press." Senna largely stayed out of this one, although on arrival at Estoril he said, "Talk is talk, but what matters are the results. I have a clear conscience that we are getting equal treatment." Andy, Prost said years later that he deliberately hadn't named Honda when he went public with these concerns, as if that somehow made it okay. But were Honda right to feel as aggrieved as they did about this accusation, effectively?
On a variety of podcasts we've put out on the race, Gary Anderson has often been asked about dealing with Honda, and he always gives a very clear answer about the culture within there and the respect they needed to be treated with and the different ways of going about getting what you needed. And I think whether he overtly named them or not, calling out Honda like that was never going to be the right thing to do. We know that the way Honda developed then was to have just like throw money at things. So they'd have multiple lines of development all going on at the same time. And that's why they would find the best route. And it might well be that on occasions something was given to Senna prior to Prost or whatever. But I don't think that they would have done something like that in a way to undermine the relationship of the team. And certainly the way to get his way was not to call them out. So I think, we'd seen in the past in the way things had ended up at Renault that for all of his brilliance and supposed professorship, when it came to being political at the right times, maybe Prost would let his emotions overrule his head.
Yeah, and in fairness, Honda's position on this was always that the engines arrived at the track and I think the mechanics flipped a coin to decide who got what. But Alain was adamant that he'd seen boxes during his time at McLaren with things like engine or special for Ayrton, I think was the quote he used. But despite leading Senna by 20 points in the championship with just 36 remaining in the era of 9 points for a win, Prost arrived in Portugal still pretty downbeat. He admitted he didn't feel comfortable with the problems that were going on behind the scenes, and that was picked up on by those that were working with him at McLaren as well. In the book titled Alain Prost, McLaren, put together by Maurice Hamilton, McLaren's Dave Ryan said it was noticeable how Prost's demeanour changed as the Senna feud took its toll. Ryan said, as 1989 went on, we could see he was no longer the bubbly guy he had been. There was a definite change. The time with Ayrton left its mark. Perhaps Alain didn't handle that situation particularly well, but the reality is he probably was hard done by. Saying that, he never complained to the guys in the garage. When he was with us, he did his job. Interestingly, in that same book, Ron Dennis said that he felt Prost left for Ferrari after 1989 because by that time he just couldn't cope with Ayrton in the other car. So Sam, looking at the wider story here, should Prost have been able to handle this situation better than he did?
It's a yes and no, really, for me. I think, which kind of befits this complex and fascinating year for Prost. You can understand why the Senna and Honda love affair riled him. I mean, that's just natural. But I think he could deal with that over the course of a season to some extent. Although, clearly it sort of piqued his ire a little bit before Estoril. But it was really the deepening relationship between Ron Dennis and Senna that actually probably hurt him more. And I remember that Prost had, he was such a part of McLaren. He was McLaren for so many years before this and had brought 2 titles in 85 and 86, arguably should have won in 84 as well. It all seemed like a match made in heaven. And then, Senna arrives with this pre-existing relationship with Honda. So, I think if you'd have thought about it in 86, 87, you could genuinely have seen Prost seeing out his career at McLaren. And matching, if not beating, Fangio's then record 5 titles. But as I said, Senna then arrived and changed that whole vibe really in the team. What I think a lot of us don't appreciate in the Prost and Senna thing was that they were just at very different stages of their career. There's been this kind of myth that's brewed up since Senna's death, along with many others, that that they shared a lot in terms of the same challenges and character and values. Well, I think a lot of that is rubbish, to be honest. I think Prost was 5 years older than Senna and didn't have the same type of motivations as Senna at that early stage. Well, at that stage of their careers, the way they operated, yes, it did have some similarities, but they were vastly different characters. I think Prost could and should have handled things a lot better, yes. But after Senna won the title in 88, he was the irresistible force and he was the immovable object, wasn't he? So what Prost should have realised with all his experience with it was just never going to work in the team, and he probably should have realised that a lot earlier and potentially got another drive for 89. But it was just a year of pain in 89 for him, and those signals that 12 months earlier in Estoril when Senna fainted across and almost put him in the pit wall, that was a literal physical thing that should have realized, that Prost should have realized it was over at McLaren. So I don't think it could have been that clearer to him. He could have handled it better. And when you look at the more experience that he had in F1, he had four extra seasons on Senna, and I think he should have probably used those to his benefit at that stage.
Away from McLaren, another big story in Portugal was the debut of a new car for Williams, the FW13. Williams had contested the first 12 races of the year with the FW12C, which was an updated version of its 1988 car, adapted to take the new Renault V10 engine for 1989. The FW13 would be Williams' car throughout 1990, so depending on how you want to look at this, it was either the latest arrival for a new car ever, or so close to the end of the season, or actually the earliest start we've ever seen with a new car, given Williams was getting 4 races in at the end of 89 with it. Williams technical guru Patrick Head played down the introduction of the new car at the time, saying it was nothing startling and that it was just putting a new front end on the new rear that had been designed for the switch from Judd to Renault power for 1989. However, reflecting on the FW13 for Maurice Hamilton's book about the history of Williams, Patrick was brutally honest. Shock. He said, the FW13 was really an abject failure. We had moved our wind tunnel from the original factory, and the commissioning of the wind tunnel in the new factory had been done extremely badly. In the keenness to get it up and operating, the proper check to see it was functioning had not been done. We had done a test in the wind tunnel that showed that a higher nose and front wing had given us 150 pounds of downforce, and we thought that was the way to go. I asked for the test to be done again, and the 150 pounds of downforce had disappeared. We thought there was no point in doing it for nothing, so we didn't. So Sam, thinking about a team introducing a new car 4 races from the end of the season, is that the most bizarre timing for a new car to arrive that you can think of?
It is actually. I can't think of another top team introducing a car that late in a season, or let's call it a Frankenstein car, because that's what this was. It was stitching one end onto another and giving it another designation. Well, Estoril was a slow start for that car, and Patrese was almost 2 seconds away from pole, but it still started 6 on the grid. Try and explain that to today's Drive to Survive infused audiences. It's quite difficult to, isn't it? But the car was really erratic that weekend in Estoril. I watched a bit of YouTube coverage of the practice sessions, and the thing was really unstable on the straight. You could see that it was ducking and weaving and bobbing around. So I don't think they quite thought that through. It obviously needed a lot more testing, but Boots had lost his front nose portion in practice, and it had dislodged itself. It clearly wasn't ready to race in that package, in that format. Doing that, bringing 2 different ends of the car and trying to get it to work. Ultimately, Williams did a pretty decent job. It was scoring points in the in the next race and finished the season off reasonably well with that victory in Adelaide. So. But yeah, very bizarre, and it just, it's probably a legacy and a knock-on of the fact that they had that sort of interim season in '88 with the Judd, and then the Renault was actually, pretty late to the party, and they used the 12C. Could they have waited, or should they have waited till 90? Probably. The 12C actually got some really good results earlier in the season. Boutsen won in Montreal, albeit in the wet, and Patrese had a run of 3 consecutive second positions. But they chose to blood it quickly in the races, and not ideal, but at least they gave it a go.
Let's get into what we'll call the Arrows section of this episode, as there was quite a bit of Arrows news going on around the time of this race. The first story was that Ross Brawn would be leaving his role as chief designer, heading off to work for Tom Walkinshaw's Jaguar team in sports cars. Brawn said in his book that it was Arrows' current drivers Eddie Cheever and Derek Warwick that enticed him to make the move, as they'd been racing in sports cars as well, and he found the new Group C rule set fabulous because it was Formula 1 with covered wheels and the rules were very loose. Summing up his 3 years at Arrows, Brawn said, "It wasn't bad. It was a great period for me because it was the first time I had taken on that level of responsibility. I was designing the cars myself. The difficulty was they always ran out of money halfway through the year, so we would make a great start and we'd fade during the year, which got incredibly frustrating." Now, Andy, Arrows finished 7th, 5th and 7th during Brawn's time there in the Constructors' Championship. How good a job do you think he did with them?
This is quite an interesting question, because I was thinking back to the time when all this was going on, and obviously I was an avid reader of Autosport and whatever. The key or superstar designers then were Gordon Murray, John Barnard, Steve Nichols, Harvey Posthwaite, Patrick Head. I don't really recall Ross Brawn's name being mentioned that much. I was aware of him because I was poring over Pit and Paddock, I needed to know every word of it. But obviously, in that season where they'd finished 5th, they were running the Megatron Turbo, so they had an enormous horsepower advantage so long as they could make the fuel last to the end. So I'm not sure that I really paid that much attention to what they were doing technically. I'm thinking back to those cars, the 87, 88 cars, they look neat. I mean, they obviously had that nice F&G livery on them. I never know what they did. Was it clothing or something, wasn't it? I've no idea. And then, the car for this year was quite interesting looking, but I guess it was one of those ones where they had the same driver lineup for like a million years, and you're never quite sure how good the car is when you have teammates that are together for that long. But I never really thought about Arrows in that way, but clearly they didn't have a lot of money. They did on occasion punch above their weight, but I think the circumstances were more to do with the transition that Formula One was in. Now, obviously, in hindsight, you look back like at that Haas car that Newey and Braun worked on, you think, oh, that must have been amazing. But of course, it can only really be as good as the resources that you've got at your disposal. And as Ross says in his quotes there, they never really had the money to see it through. So I think, they did all right. They did a very Arrows job. I don't know how they finished in the constructors the years after that, but I imagine that quite a lot of the time they were between 5th and 7th.
I think they had a bit of a decline in the early 90s.
I am forgetting the Porsche footwork nonsense. Yes, of course.
We'll get to footwork in a moment. Arrows did at least have a notable incoming on the driver front, with Michele Alboreto signing up to join them for 1990 after his rocky 1989 that involved a split with Tyrrell and then turning up at Le Rousse. This was still only 12 months on from when Alboreto had been a Ferrari driver, and he admitted that he needed some stability back in his life. Speaking about the move to Arrows, he said, "At the moment, Arrows is the best solution for me. It's quite a good team. I need a quiet season to prepare to come back. This year has been really bad from that point of view." So Sam, as I mentioned there, a year before this, Alboreto was still at Ferrari. How far had his stock fallen in those 12 months? Was he damaged goods by now, or was this a good signing for Arrows?
I think when you look at the drop-off for Michele at Ferrari, it actually came in back in 87 when Burgt arrived and just got the better of him. He was quicker and he got better results. I think he was quite lucky to stay in a way for 88 at Ferrari. He did seem like a spent force in terms of being an out-and-out Grand Prix winner or challenging to be a winner. The reality, though, was that he was still a very capable driver, of course, and very good on his day. Tyrrell found that out in Monaco and Mexico, where he scored 5th and 3rd places, respectively, in a new car. So, we've touched upon the switch to Le Rousse, or the exit from Tyrrell, which is still sort of shrouded in some mystery to this day. But it didn't work with Le Rousse. It was a bit of a disaster. The Lola and Lamborghini project was still finding its feet and didn't come into its own until 1990. Imagine what Michele might have done with that lovely Lola LC90, because when you consider that rookies like Suzuki and Bernard were finishing consistently in the top 6, then Michele certainly could have got podiums, I think, in 90 had he stayed there. Was it a good move? Yeah, I think it was a good move for Jackie Oliver. I think he could see that Alboreto wasn't a spent force and that had more to give. And on his day, the old flashes of brilliance were still there. It's one of those things, isn't it? A bit like Patrese after those wilderness years at Alfa Romeo in the mid-80s, or even Jacques Lafitte after he was so poor for Frank Williams in 84. They have this this late flowering results and this kind of Indian summer. So it wasn't quite over for Michele, and I think it was the perfect fit for Arrows at that time, when they obviously lost Warwick to Lotus, and Cheever had gone to IndyCar. So I think a good move all round, really. Yeah,
I was just thinking that there was, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there was a lot of rumours ahead of this season about him going to Williams, and I think that would have been quite a smart move on both sides there. Well, I agree completely with Sam that his days as a peak race-winning driver had been obliterated when Burgt came on the scene in 87. And 87 spec Burgt, I think, was the most exciting thing on the grid. I just loved watching him in that fantastic 87 Ferrari. But I think he still had something to offer in terms of the experience that he was bringing that probably warranted a place slightly further up the grid. And obviously, we're going to get into how what might have come with that footwork thing at another time. But I think there was still Alboreto still had something to offer.
We'll stick with Arrows for a little bit longer, and we will mention its future partner Footwork, because at this stage of 1989, Footwork was working on its own F1 project with the intention of scaling up its F3000 operation to become a fully fledged F1 team. However, just a few months later, in January 1990, Footwork would buy into Arrows, and this was after failed talks with Tyrrell and Onyx. Tyrrell said the money Footwork had wasn't enough for the stake that they wanted, and Onyx's enigmatic backer Jean-Pierre Van Rossum said his team didn't need the money. And we'll come back to him and Onyx's finances shortly. Footwork owner Wataru Ahashi tasked his European coordinator John Wickham with finding a way to get footwork onto the grid, and eventually any ideas of setting up a team gave way to buying into one, which Wickham suggested to Motorsport magazine in 2020 was always the main intention. But Andy, thinking back to this period, this was still the peak for anyone and everyone thinking they could set up their own F1 team and work their way up from pre-qualifying to become an established operation. What do you make of what Footwork did? Did they take a better approach by buying into a team that was already on the grid?
When I saw this question on the script, I sort of ended up going down a really sort of philosophical answer to it. And I think both Sam and I, around the time that all this was playing out, were 14, 15 years old. And there's something around the fandom and the way you experience things at that time that's very different to how it becomes as you get older and more mature. And it's like, there is like the one love that you have. And I so adored Formula One at this time. You know, I would literally pore over everything I could get. I must have bought about 16 different season previews to this season as everybody put them out. And part of the reason for that was because of the way that teams could come in, set it up and, you know, establish themselves. And it wasn't quite just get a DFV and a Hewland, but you almost could, right? You could get a relatively competitive engine if you had enough resources and a good designer, as Jordan would show, and as we'll talk about later with the Onyx here, and even Sam mentioned that debut for the Colonia. Moreno put it 15th on the grid. You know, it was a half decent car. Just getting out of pre-qualifying was almost impossible because I think they had about 6 people working at Colonia at the time. If they had the smallest technical problem, they were done for the day. But going back to the actual question, I do think a team like Arrows that have been around for a long time, has an established infrastructure, had come close to winning races and be operating at a relatively high level. I don't know what they paid for it, but I imagine that Jackie Oliver knew the value of a pound, so they probably put quite a lot of money in. In theory, that was quite a smart move. Now, would they be better off? I don't know, go into a Peter Sauber or somebody like this that's operating outside of F1 and partnering with them? Maybe. But I think buying into Arrows was a logical thing for them to do at the time, especially as we discussed earlier, them hovering, you know, at that sort of in between the front end of the midfield regularly.
Now, we briefly mentioned Onyx, and they were in the news in the build-up to this weekend as well, as they fired Bertrand Gachot. The team claimed this was because Gachot had made negative comments in the Belgian media, which he denied, and by the time he learned of this on the Wednesday before the race, he was already in Portugal. So let's hear Gachot's version of this story, which he recently told to Tom Clarkson on F1's Beyond the Grid podcast.
Basically, the team needed money. Van Rossum, as we know, didn't have the resources, so he had to find a way. And Keke Rosberg came and promised him to millions of dollars if he took JJ Leto. I remember I was in Portugal with my girlfriend on the beach, and I came back to the hotel because before the race, you know, we came to Portugal. I went to the beach during the day. In the afternoon, I come back to the hotel and they say, so what do you say about being fired? And I looked at them and I said, have I been fired? And they said, yeah, you've been fired. And I said, why? And they said, you held a press conference in Belgium. I said, no, but I'm here. And I said, it's a mistake. So I went to see Van Rossum that night and he said, look, I have no choice. He gave me a contract that he would pay me so much money. And I thought to myself, I take the money. Basically, he was going to give me 1 million out of the 3 million or 4 million that Rosberg was going to pay him for JJ Leto. I just took the contract and I said, it's better to get out of here.
That Gachot interview is well worth checking out, I must say, even if only to hear his side of the story that ended up with him in prison and Michael Schumacher getting to make his F1 debut for Jordan at Spa in 1991. But back to 1989, a day after announcing Gachot was fired, Van Rossum said it was just a one-race suspension, but the race team on the ground in Portugal were saying Gachot wouldn't race for Onyx again. Onyx's lead driver, Stefan Johansson, who we'll come back to later, said money was always tight. He told Motorsport magazine in 2010, the team was right on the edge with money. Funds would appear just in time to get to the next race, but I couldn't get paid. Race followed race without a sniff. And he said he eventually got paid at the penultimate race of the season in Japan, where he was given his entire salary of nearly $1 million in cash. So we'll tell that story in more depth when we do Suzuka 89.
That's not dodgy at all, Glenn. That's absolutely
Yeah,
legit.
that's straight up. I'm sure getting what bags and bags of cash out of Japan is not difficult at all. But Sam, around this time, Onyx had turned down significant investment from Footwork and now couldn't make up its mind if it had fired one of its drivers or not. It's planning to pay Johansson in a few weeks' time in cash. Is it any wonder this team wouldn't last even another 12 months from this point?
Absolutely none at all. No, I mean, which was just a huge shame, wasn't it? Because it had so much going for it, particularly Johansson, Alan Jenkins, Mike Earl, who was running it. But with Van Rossum at the helm, who surely has a claim to be the most bonkers F1 entrant ever, it was always going to be a disaster, really. Actually, the whole thing's pretty criminal, and I use that word in the broadest sense possible, that the team failed. If it had been run properly, then it could have become another Jordan or a Sauber and stayed in F1 for decades and had a lot of success, no doubt about that. The constituent parts, or many of them, were great. It was just that it was kind of a product of its time, wasn't it? You know, VW was talking before about that sort of thing. Those late 80s capitalist dreams which spawned easy money schemes and would get everyone very rich, well, they were two a penny, really. But it just happened to be that this was the mother and father of all of them, with this really just a dodgy Ponzi scheme, let's say. I mean, Van Rossum was actually a Marxist economist. Now, I'm no expert on business matters, but I'm pretty sure that's not a great combination. I mean, you know, a wild-haired Marxist at that, and he had a supercomputer that no one had ever seen that was called Moneytron, that claimed to generate £7 billion of assets. I mean, what possibly could go wrong? As he said himself, the man said himself, if you show 1 million returns to millionaires, they no longer ask questions. So, you know, in terms of motifs for teams, I think that's got to be one of the most bizarre at all. I just think, you know, he signed off his own epitaph there, didn't he? I mean, it's just a ludicrous scheme that was never going to work. You wouldn't believe that if it was an episode of Doctor Who or something, would you? I mean, it was just utterly bizarre. I was 14 in 1989, and even I didn't believe in any of it. So what chance did the team have of surviving? Yeah, very little.
Was it last summer he died, or the summer before? Anyway, there were some just phenomenal stories that came out in the obituaries there, and people should go and check. I don't think the whole podcast could do them justice, as some of them.
No, agreed. And I think we'll sum him up as a character, which is a word you can read into that word what you would like.
That's a great euphemism.
Yeah. But however, brilliant little car, brilliant little team with some good people. I was very fond of Onyx, and it's a shame they didn't stick around for longer. Up to the front of the grid, though, and there was a departure at Ferrari, where iconic designer John Barnard was on his way out. And a week later, he would be announced at Benetton, but we'll save that part of the story for a Jerez 1989 episode in the future. As for his Ferrari exit, Barnard felt that the political pressure within Ferrari had become too much by 1989, despite producing the second best car on the grid and creating the paddle shift gear change mechanism for that season. The main point of contention between Barnard and Ferrari was, of course, that he was running his own design office from the UK rather than working full-time from Maranello. Enzo Ferrari had signed off on this when he brought Barnard in for 1987, but after Enzo's death in 1988, Barnard had less protection from the politics of Ferrari. In his book, titled The Perfect Car, Barnard accepted that trying to work from England was difficult, and he admitted that there was secrecy from both sides of the England-Italy divide. Interestingly, he said that revisiting what he went through in step-by-step detail for the book opened his eyes to what it was actually like. He said, "It brings home the hill I was pushing up was even steeper than I realised, and shows just how difficult it was day to day to make progress at Ferrari, where you were faced not just with technical problems, but massive political chicanery. I was dreading the phone ringing with news of more crap from Maranello." That Andy, famously, Barnard would go back to Ferrari and do this again, but was his desire to run the design operation from the UK instead of Italy always doomed?
when you look at things through the prism of today, we're all remote working, we're recording this remotely, and it's almost second nature now, and to the point where, I don't envisage us ever going back to an office 5 days a week. But this was 2 generations ago, before effectively the internet as we know it existed. I don't know how he thought it could be anything else other than a failure, really. Ferrari had always been a peak and trophy team, but that bit in the early 80s when tragically they didn't win championships when they should have done was by Postlethwaite going there and gelling the chassis and engine bits together. We know Enzo was an engine man. They would have his ear. They were always right. The chassis guys were always wrong. If you're going to put in 1,000 or more miles between you, you've got no hope of success, especially, at the time when you're limited by how the technology can work. So I can understand his desire. And as always with Barnard, he was 30 years ahead of his time. It would work a treat now, as it does for lots of these things. But in 1987, it had a 0% chance of success. And they got the inevitable outcome of that. He still managed to produce one of the most influential, groundbreaking cars of all time. It just never delivered on its potential.
Yeah, groundbreaking and beautiful. Barnard's Ferrari departure took a final turn after the race in Portugal when he was flown by private jet to team boss Cesare Fiorio's house for talks over a new deal. Barnard said he had an offer from Benetton, which he says prompted a big show of asking me to stay. But he said for all the bluster, a concrete offer was never made, and he suspected Fiorio wasn't that fussed about keeping him on board. Barnard added, Cesare had obviously been asked by the higher-ups to keep me on board. Fiorio's a politician. He wanted to be kingpin. All the Italians want to be kingpin at Ferrari. I was probably too powerful. So Sam, given the difficulties we've discussed there of managing offices in the UK and Italy, was Fiorio right to have these doubts about keeping Barnard, or was he just playing politics?
I tend to think the latter. Fiorio was imbued in politics through his years at Lancia and at Ferrari. He didn't have a long career at Ferrari, but it was a notable one in that sort of 80 post Enzo period to that debacle in 1991. And I always got the opinion that he was reasonably Machiavellian in what was going on. He did preside over 2 pretty competitive seasons in 89 and 90. But I think it was pretty telling what John Barnard said there, wasn't it? That his power had grown substantially from his second period at Ferrari as opposed to the first in the mid 80s. So it was probably that there was a lot of jostling, there was a lot of jockeying positions in Ferrari and also within Fiat, who were the owners of Ferrari at that time. And I think that was just a legacy of the power vacuum that was created when Enzo died the previous summer. So it was a legacy of that, and in typical Ferrari style in this period, it just created another layer of mess on top of a mess, and ultimately probably contributed to what happened in 91 when it all fell over, and then De Montezemolo came back for his second bite at the Ferrari cherry. So I think Barnard, it was inevitable in some ways that he was going to move on, but I don't think he anticipated that it would be so quickly. But obviously, what was Ferrari's loss was ultimately Benetton's gain.
There was another change in the driver lineup for this weekend, although this one was far less contentious than the one we discussed at Onyx, as it was only temporary, with Johnny Herbert being called up for the second time to replace Jean Alesi at Tyrrell, as Alesi focused on his ultimately successful F3000 campaign. Herbert had driven for Tyrrell at Spa as well a few weeks earlier, and this had given him a handy route back into F1 after he was dropped by Benetton earlier in the year, which we talked about in depth in our France 89 episode in the past. Herbert said in his book that he jumped at the chance to get back to racing with Tyrrell, but he now accepts that was a mistake and he should have kept focusing on his battle back to fitness following his injuries sustained in his massive 3000 crash at Brands Hatch in 1988, which had put his entire career in jeopardy. Johnny said, I was feeling a heck of a lot better, but even so, what I should have done was politely refuse the offer, keep my head down and carry on working. I don't think you'll find a racing driver anywhere on earth who would have done that. Johnny failed to qualify in Portugal, missing the cut by 17 thousandths of a second. He described the weekend as a disaster, adding, "At least it made me appreciate once and for all that if I was ever going to get back into Formula One on a permanent basis, I was first going to have to spend a bit of time away from it." Sam, it would be just over a year before Johnny would be back in action on an F1 race weekend after this. How important was it for him to go away and get himself right physically and mentally after what he'd been through in the previous 12 months?
I think the simple truth was that he should never really actually have been in a racing car at all at that level in early '89. I mean, for all the heroics of Rio, it was probably irresponsible for anyone to get him driving that early, just a few months after almost having his foot amputated. I say all that with some hindsight, of course, and I'm not belittling that incredible achievement, getting fourth in Rio, because personally, I think it's right up there with Lauda's bravery and determination at Monza in '76. It's in that bracket, definitely, as a courageous act. I think if he'd have taken 1989 completely to reset himself and maybe raced over in Japan earlier and got back to a fuller fitness, it would have paid massive dividends in the end. I mean, why couldn't Pirro have done the first half until Johnny was fit, say, in '89? But yeah, it's a lot of hindsight there. I think the feeling at the time in Formula One was that, you know, if you only really had one chance of it in the highest category, and I suppose that came from drivers such as Stephen South earlier in the '80s and Mike Thackwell to some extent, where, you know, they were so young and they got an early chance and then it never really came back for them. I think the fact that he did go to Japan and did those few cameos with Tyrrell and Lotus in '89 and '90 was the next best thing for him. And it worked out well by '91 with that full-time drive and Le Mans win. I still think the way he was treated by Briatore early on in '89 was shoddy. You know, to have Pirro waiting at the airport and putting pressure on Johnny when he's not even finished or started a Grand Prix was a bit much. You know, if you're going to commit to a driver, then at least give him a full and unconditional support. He had that from Peter Collins, of course, but Briatore's tentacles were already becoming ever powerful at the team by that stage. But it's entirely in keeping with Briatore's erratic way of dealing with drivers, isn't it? That, you know, he signed Herbert again at the end of '94 and then seemed to lose interest in him in '95. That's just the way it was. But, you know, ultimately, I think for Herbert, I think if he'd have sat that period out and come back, he would have been even stronger and may have been even better. Who knows?
Let's look at what made that weekend so difficult for Johnny. In the run-up to the event, his injured foot became infected. This was pretty common for him since his 3000 accident, although it never happened on a race weekend. And I won't go into the gruesome detail Johnny does in his book, other than to quote him saying, "I had remnants of the accident emanating from me for about 3 years after the shunt, and it was never pleasant." And as I say, that's the toned down version. There is much more detail in Johnny's book if those sort of things are what you're into. The infection would make Johnny's foot swell up, and he said this made him look like a walking freak show in the paddock. He said, "I was finding walking almost impossible. I remember trying to make my way down the paddock one afternoon and realising that everyone was staring at me. I couldn't bend my ankle at all, and my foot was about twice the size it normally was. God only knows what people must have been thinking. One thing's for sure, I wasn't doing my future prospects in F1 any good whatsoever by being there. Old Mr. Damaged Goods looked like he was in danger of being beyond repair." Things got even worse for Johnny when he picked up food poisoning after eating lobster on the Friday night. So in his quest to make the cut for the 26-car grid, he wasn't helped by constantly having to pull into the garage during qualifying to, should we say, deal with the consequences of food poisoning. Johnny added, "If this was nature's way of telling me to take a rest from Formula One, it was making its point loud and clear." So Andy, we've talked about the importance of don't miss your chance, you know, get on the train when it's leaving the station. But is Johnny right that in the eyes of the F1 paddock, there's a crossover point where you go from being a trooper who never gives up to, in his words, damaged goods beyond repair?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that makes Johnny such a lovely and engaging bloke is his sense of perspective on things, and in this, he's absolutely nailed it. And Sam was quite right when he was talking about, how you only get one shot and you've got to take it. But I think Johnny was, lucky is the wrong word given the whole set of circumstances that he's gone through, but fortunate that he was racing in a time of 30 cars, as we discussed. So there were opportunities to get back in, and the fact that he had Peter Collins believing in him made that happen. I think had those sort of set of circumstances happened in a time of 20 cars, it's quite likely that he never would have found a way back into F1, which would have been a travesty, really. But by this point, he was doing himself no favours at all, rocking up, clearly not being fit to race, struggling to get the car even onto the grid. It's all downhill. There's something like, which I'm coining the Piastri effect at the minute, which is every race he doesn't do, he will get quicker. Yeah, every time he's not in that car, he gets a little bit quicker. In many ways, if Johnny had been dropped after Rio, he'd have been fantastically quick by the time it got to the end of the season, because you just live on that little bit of reputation that you've shown. So in typical Johnny fashion, he's absolutely understood the situation he was in there, yeah.
Now, while Herbert was missing the cut at the front, Senna was comfortably on pole, ahead of the two Ferraris, with Prost only fourth. And behind Prost was the Minardi of Pierluigi Martini, who we'll come back to in a bit, because that wasn't even the peak of his weekend. When the race got going, the Ferraris had the measure of Senna. Burgt took the lead at the start, and on lap 8, Mansell went through as well to make it a Ferrari 1-2. Mansell then set about charging after Burgt, who had cooked his tyres by pushing too hard at the beginning. On lap 24, Mansell got a run on Burgt, who was balked by a couple of backmarkers, Stefano Modena and Derek Warwick. Burgt felt his 7th gear was too short as well, so he couldn't just breeze past the slower cars without running out of revs in their slipstream. So when he saw Mansell coming, he gestured to him to go through into the lead. But Mansell didn't stop there, passing Modena and Warwick in a 3 abreast pass into turn 1 as well. Sam, there's two things here really. How remarkable was it after nearly 2 years of wall-to-wall McLaren domination to see Ferrari in total control of a race? And what did you make of Mansell's daring way to take the lead?
Well, the Ferrari 640 always had the pace. That was evident from Rio, when it somehow held together to give Mansell that memorable debut win. Burgt should have had a few podiums at least, but had just had really desperate, unlucky reliability problems, consistent reliability problems. So it was always going to come together at some point, and at Estoril it finally seemed to do that. The way Burgt pulled away in the early stage of that race was really eye-catching. He had the McLarens beaten, but it was clear that he was also rooting his tyres more. So, it was a quick car, and on that day it was going to beat the McLarens, come what may. The Mansell move was kind of fairly typical of Nigel in that era, wasn't it? The moves that he made were always dramatic, even if it was a slipstream. He always got as close as possible to the car in front if it was a classic simple slipstream. And he always ducked out and jinked out and then, tried to squeeze them or whatever. There was never an easy pass from Nigel, so you couldn't fail to be impressed by that and his sheer courage. I think at one stage it looked dodgy in this moment because Modena and Warwick were having a scrap, and I think he was fortunate that it was Warwick who was so experienced and knew what was going on around him on that narrow pit straight. It was a nicely executed move, but one in which I think was slightly given to him on a plate by Burgt. He was certainly aware that Nigel was quicker and had the better slingshot out of that last corner. But still, Nigel had to judge it correctly, and he did so. The last thing anyone wanted was for him to end up in the turn 1 gravel, wasn't it? That would never do at Estoril on that day.
Unsurprisingly, Burgt was the first of the leaders to pit, coming in on lap 34 once Senna had caught him back up. Burgt said he'd been asking to come in for 4 laps, and eventually he made the decision on his own to just drive into the pits. Senna was in a lap later and had a slow stop. Then 4 laps later, Mansell came in, and this was the moment we mentioned earlier that transformed the race. Mansell came piling into the pits, completely overshot and missed his marks. Then before his mechanics could get to him, he whacked it into reverse and backed into his pit stall. Mansell said in his book, in the one he released in the 1990s, that he only did this once he felt none of his mechanics were going to come and pull him back into position. Unfortunately, reversing in the pit lane was against the rules, but we'll come back to that element in a moment. Mansell blamed McLaren for obscuring his view of the Ferrari pit, claiming they left tyres and equipment in the way, even though both McLaren drivers had made their pit stops by this point. So Andy, just looking at the pit lane incident in isolation, any sympathy for Nigel here, or is this just an unacceptable blunder?
So obviously I recalled this at the top of the show, and while I could see Mansell's reversing in my mind, I recalled those McLaren guys being right in the way. So I rewatched this about 20 times last night so I could get a very clear picture of it. And while they don't make any effort to get out of his way, they're doing absolutely nothing wrong. He just simply comes in way too hot, locks up and goes by. The other bit, I take a little bit of exception to what Nigel claims there, is there's a guy at his car within like half a second trying to put it back.
Yes.
And he's gone. The guy's there to try to push the wing, and he's just zipped out of the way. I mean, they couldn't push him as quickly as he reverses again, but I'm just in awe of his reversing capability. I see people who can't reverse park on my street as well as that every day. So it's just stunning. But I do have a tiny bit of sympathy, though, because of the way the pit lanes were set up in those days. No pit lane speed limit, which just seems completely bonkers now. There doesn't seem to be any limit to the number of people they can have there. It seems to be scores of people scattered up and down the pit lane, just ambling about in shorts and T-shirts. I mean, it looks insanely dangerous, especially by today's standards. So that bit, I have a little bit of sympathy for him. But you've got to own your mistakes. And in this, it's his error, and he's got to own it.
Yeah, I mean, you watch it, and I did the same thing. You read Nigel's account, and you go, really? Like, is my memory playing tricks on me? I think he comes piling into the pits, having negotiated that little chicane on the way in, and I think he's lost sort of his eye line is looking in the wrong place. You can see his helmet very clearly. I just think he's looking almost too far down the pits, and then by the time, and he said this at the time, by the time he spotted the yellow shirts, it was too late of the Ferrari mechanics. But this was only the start of the drama. Mansell rejoined the race, and he was black flagged for reversing in the pits, but he didn't see the flag, and by this point he was locked into a battle with Senna again. Mansell drove past the black flag 3 times, then he attacked Senna for second into the first corner, and they collided, both being taken out on the spot. 1976 world champion James Hunt was commentating on the race for BBC, and he blamed Senna for the clash, saying, "There are times when a driver has to face he's been beaten to a corner, and this was one of them. When Ayrton turned in, he gave Mansell no chance of avoiding him. Mansell had won the corner." So Sam, before we go back to the black flag controversy here, just looking at that collision in racing terms, what did you think? Is it a racing incident, or was someone at fault?
It's actually a really difficult one to call, and probably, I mean, I tend to go under the bracket of racing incident. I did then, and I kind of do now in a way. Of course, now, there'd be hell and fury with 5 million Twitter opinions beating down my door. But, it looked like a classic Senna offer of, I'm shutting the door, and if you don't like it, we're going to have a shunt. That's what it looked like. Unfortunately for Ayrton, Mansell was usually the wrong person to give that ultimatum to, and a collision was inevitable. The same thing happened at Spa in '87, didn't it? So those two, they were just the wrong people to get into that kind of scenario. In the context of the title fight, Senna, though, had absolutely no need to be that aggressive. And he was second at that stage and Prost was fourth. He was going to get, I don't think he would have beaten Burgt that day anyway. So it was probably a second and a third for McLaren if that hadn't have happened, although, possibly even a third and fourth. It was a classic case of Ayrton not knowing when he was beaten to all intents and purposes. And it really, at that stage, it looked like he'd completely ended any realistic title defence. Having said that, Mansell was nowhere near alongside, nowhere near in comparison to what he had done a few laps earlier when he'd taken Senna fair and square into turn one. So letter of the law, when you look at it, it's probably 60-40 Mansell's fault. But with the fact that he was black flagged, you can argue that, it was Mansell being reckless as well and ignoring the flag. That's a separate issue. Or perhaps, you can look at it as Senna and McLaren being caught on the back foot through poor communication. Where was the radio message to Senna? Where was the pit board saying that, don't worry about Nigel? That didn't come, or it did just as the incident happened when it was too late. So when you put all that in the mix, it's deciding who was at fault is a tough one. There's a lot going on in it, isn't there? I'm going to go with Mansell being mostly at fault, because ultimately he just didn't make the move completely stick. And then with the baggage of the black flag, he and Ferrari have to take responsibility more than McLaren, because they had triggered the original infraction through Mansell's error.
I think this move completely encapsulates the single biggest flaw in Senna's armoury. There is absolutely no way he didn't know that Mansell was getting a black flag. You see it, I think it's 3 laps in a row that bunch rider's hanging over the pit lane, waving at them as they're going down there. He would have seen it, seen the number. He saw it more clearly than the TV commentators did. I mean, listening back to it, they didn't have a clue it was being there. Murray seems to decide it must be Senna because it couldn't possibly be Nigel because he's British, which is just the weirdest piece of commentary for a bit. Then they seem to think that he's all right because he drove back in the pit lane, but he wasn't pushed, so that's probably. And then Dudson basically goes, "Is Mansell because he drove back? You can't drive backwards in the pit lane, guys. It just can't happen." It takes an age for them to work out what it is. But anyway, but he knows this. Then Mansell has clearly pulled out of his slipstream, and he turns into that corner as if there is a 0% chance that Mansell could be anywhere. So he makes no concession whatsoever for Mansell being there. A guy he's racing against who was going to be disqualified, or at very least have to come in and pit. That complete lack of compromise in his makeup there, as Senna, is in one way, it's made him absolutely brilliant, but there's also his single biggest flaw. So you're probably right, Sam, especially knowing that he was being black flagged. Mansell shouldn't have done it, but it's the way that Senna just does it, right? He doesn't even take an inch over to the left to potentially give him some room. It's just bang, have it or not. I'm opening a can of worms here, but it is Silverstone 21, right? That is exactly what it is. Completely uncompromising.
Yeah, we've got a few years before we're giving Silverstone 21 the bring back whatever this podcast will be called by then treatment. So yeah, we won't go there just yet. Mansell said he only learned when he got back to the Ferrari motorhome that he'd been black flagged. In his book, he wrote, "I was tucked up under Ayrton's rear wing looking for a way past into the first corner. I genuinely had no idea. If I had known about the black flag, I certainly wouldn't have wasted my time fighting Senna. When you're locked in a fight like that, running right on his gearbox at close to 200 miles per hour, you don't see black flags. Ayrton said himself that he hadn't seen it and he was in front." As Sam hinted at there, McLaren boss Ron Dennis took some of the blame for not telling Senna sooner that Mansell was no longer a factor in the race. However, Ron was sure that Mansell would have seen the flag. Ron said, "I could have avoided Ayrton being involved in that accident, but I made a mistake. It would have been easy for me to have advised him. I'd started talking to him along the straight and finished talking to him at the end of it, and he said, 'Repeat.' It was then that the accident happened." I think Nigel did know he was disqualified. I'm not saying how he was informed, whether it was visually, by radio or by the pit board, but I think he did know. I just don't buy this. He knew, and that's all there is to it. So I'm going to ask you both this, and Andy, I'll ask you first. Purely on the element of seeing the black flag, do you believe Nigel, or do you think he knew?
So I think it's the first lap where it's shown. He is so tightly up behind Senna's rear wing. I am willing to buy that version of the events on that first lap, but not over the 2 or 3 laps of the entirety, especially as we know how aware drivers are of their surroundings, even looking at big screens to see what the running order and everything is. The notion, was that bloke on the gantry with a number 27 and a great big black flag? Nothing to do with me. I'm not buying it at all. I'm willing to concede that radio technology was a bit rubbish then, and if you've got a screaming V10 in the back, you're probably very hard to hear what's going on. But I can't buy for a minute that they couldn't see that flag was being held over the side there.
Do you know what? I remember at the time having some sympathy for Mansell, and believe me, I was not a big Nigel fan at all. And that was because, just going into what VDB said, 2 of those 3 laps, I think, he was under Senna's rear wing. And then the lap that it happened, they were lapping Alboreto. And again, he was slingshotting Alboreto. Now, if you're doing that 190 miles an hour, I think that's a reasonable chance that you might not see. And don't forget, this was a stationary black flag. So when you look at it, it's not been waved at them. It is a stationary flag. So I think Mansell can be cut some slack there. What we don't know is that I think the first lap that it was shown, and I don't think he was under anyone's rear wing, but he may just have been focusing on ahead. I'd give him the benefit of the doubt more than VDB has there. Senna confessed he never saw it, and actually, if anyone's going to see it, it should be Senna, because he's not up anyone's chuff going down the pit straight. So yeah, the radios, it's a good point VDB makes, and the radios so much lack of clarity in those days with a big V12 in the back of that Ferrari. But I think ultimately, Nigel, I think, may have been telling the truth here. I'm not sure he always did in his career in some aspects, but I think he could have been here, and it wasn't as if taking Senna out in a risky move was going to help Burgt, or Mansell had no reason to make such a risky move there, and I think Burgt got all but 6 points to his name in the season. It wasn't going to help him out, even though he knew if he knew that he was going to be disqualified. So I do have that sympathy for Mansell, because I genuinely don't think he saw, or there's a good chance he didn't see the black flag, due to that intensity of the chase to get Senna again. Interestingly, if you go to YouTube on the review, the official FOCA review, you can see there's a static pit cam that shows Ron Dennis going up to the Ferrari Pratt perch just after the shunt, and there's a comedy exchange between them, and as Ron turns his back to go back to his pit, Fiore just gives him the single digit for about 5 seconds, and it ends there. So good old school deliberation between team principals there.
And I absolutely would buy the fact that you pretend to ignore the flag, because it gives them time to argue about it. And I don't think anyone has been disqualified before or since for this rules infraction, so you would be there trying to debate the rules and whatever. You don't want to just give up that place. But I just refuse to buy that it wasn't seen by either of them. I'm just not having it.
The only other element I would add in defence is that you've got a low sun directly in your eyes down that straight. They were driving head on into the sun, so all you can maybe see is a silhouette of a guy. But the counter argument to that, of course, is what other flag are they going to be holding out with a number at that time? So there is some Mansell onboard footage, so you can go and look for that and decide for yourselves if it's clear enough. And as the guy said, radios had started to exist by this point, but they weren't very good. The fallout doesn't end there, though, as Mansell was fined $50,000 and banned from the next race at Jerez. Mansell appealed, but the FIA International Court of Appeal wasn't able to convene in time to hear the case before Jerez, which was the weekend after Portugal. And bizarrely, Mansell couldn't race under appeal because officially it was an exclusion, and drivers could only race under appeal back then if it was a suspension or a disqualification. So if you think the FIA only deals in nonsense in modern F1, there's an example that's been going on for ages. The case rumbled on for weeks before Ferrari dropped it, but we won't get into that. We will just briefly focus on Jerez though. Ferrari was allowed to name a replacement driver, but it didn't, and Mansell attended the track to give a press conference where he claimed this might be the last time anyone saw him as an F1 driver, and he questioned the process and the severity of the punishment. He accepted that he deserved to be fined for reversing in the pits and not seeing the black flag, but he felt he was being made a scapegoat for ruining the championship because his collision with Senna left Prost in a very comfortable championship lead. Mansell said at Jerez, "I cannot believe this is happening. This is a complete nonsense. I do not and will not accept this." Mansell felt this was the work of enigmatic FISA president Jean-Marie Balestre, but Balestre said it was more simple than punishing Mansell for impacting the championship. He said, "I like Nigel, but if you are driving down the road and you're not paying attention and you don't see a red light, then you must be punished. Here it's the same thing." FISA also criticised certain members of the media for creating a muddle over the situation, which sounds a lot to me like how the FIA initially reacted to the coverage of the 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. But Andy, let's forget about 2021 if we possibly can. Was a one-race ban fair punishment for Mansell here, given everything that had gone on?
No, it's absolutely outrageous. And he is absolutely right to be livid about this. The fine, bang on. It's a lot of money as well, especially in 1989 terms. But the one race ban, no, it's completely disproportionate to anything that's gone on here. And, for people who weren't aware of how motorsport operated at the time, this is an exact example of what used to get people so angry. There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason and consistency. Now, that might seem like a very familiar way of them operating now, but it's so much better compared to what it was then. No, I think he was completely stitched up here, and I'm surprised that they ultimately relented. There must have been something that they were promised or given or whatever in the background to let that go, because I would think they were on very firm footing on protesting that. Obviously, you can't rerun the Spanish Grand Prix, so it's a bit of a moot or Pyrrhic victory if they had won it.
Yeah, I think we as I say, we won't get into it now, but yeah, they basically the only thing they could do by pushing on with the appeal was try to get the Spanish Grand Prix voided, which Ferrari realised was basically irrelevant. But yeah, they've been very good over the years, and even still are today at doing some trading in the background to get something they want in exchange for agreeing to something else. But let's get back to the rest of the race in Portugal, because briefly, when those leading cars had all pitted, and just after Mansell's botched pit stop, Pierluigi Martini's Minardi led the race for a lap. This was the only lap a Minardi ever led in F1, so we have to celebrate it. And Martini was then passed by Burgt and Senna as they came back through after their pit stops. Martini faded later in the race as he struggled with a stiff neck, but he finished fifth in the end, helped by the new Williamses, both blowing up with just over 10 or 11 laps to go. But this was a big deal for Martini as well, as he'd also just agreed a deal to stay with Minardi for 1990. Speaking about the new deal, Martini said, "I spoke with several other teams, but they are more or less on the same level as Minardi, so why change? I decided to stay because I believe in the team and Pirelli." As for Minardi's performance that weekend, he added, "What is happening is the fruit of 8 or 9 months very hard work. This has been a great weekend for our team and a nice way to celebrate the fact that I'm staying next year." So Sam, this was a great weekend for Minardi, one of the best moments in their history. And how fitting was it that such a milestone should be claimed by Martini, who is surely the most iconic Minardi driver?
Yeah, it was extraordinary, wasn't it? Because until the 89 season, Minardi had shown absolutely no hint of ever troubling the point scorers. That was until the Pirelli deal and also the M189, which was co-designed by a very young Aldo Costa, actually, who went on to win so much with Ferrari and Mercedes over the years. For Martini to be the driver that led that lap and also got the first points back, or those big points, let's say, at Silverstone, was entirely fitting, especially for geeks like me. It was exactly what the world had been waiting for. So, when a very raw Martini came in for that disastrous first Minardi season in '85, it looked like he'd destroyed his career pretty much. I mean, he was cut adrift at the back, but rebuilding it with several strong Formula 3000 campaigns, sort of just made him a stronger driver and got him back into F1. On his day, Martini was a real contender. I think in a decent car, or a consistently decent car, I'm pretty sure he could have got a Grand Prix win, no doubt about it. I thought he was really good enough. But yeah, it was the feel good story of that race weekend, wasn't it? And probably of '89 as well.
I was saying earlier about how very much in love I was with Formula 1. I think this might be my single favourite thing that's ever happened in Formula 1. Minardi leading that lap and watching the rerun of the race last night. I hadn't really seen it before, but after Burgt passes him and so does Senna, they're lapping one of the Lolas, and he has a little nibble in the back of the screen back at Senna, try and overtake him. It's like, come on, and it's just the whole romance of it. Like you, Sam, I desperately wanted to see him get in a good car, but I've got a feeling he was Giancarlo Fisichella, and he would have been mega in a midfield car and nowhere near good enough in a front running car. But the fact he never did makes it a brilliant what if story, because there's no proof to take either side of that argument. But it's just such a brilliant moment in a time when a tiny little team in Italy could lead a Grand Prix. It's lovely.
Yeah, we've got so much time here for Minardi. We'll always find ways to squeeze them into episodes when we can. And brilliant. Just it's such a nice looking car as well in 1989. So yeah, how can you not love Minardi? But back to the front. With Mansell and Senna out of the race, Burgt took a comfortable win by over half a minute from Prost. And I'll just quickly say, Burger's full onboard from this race exists on YouTube. So if you do a clever bit of searching, it's something like Gerhard Berger, full onboard, 1989 Portuguese Grand Prix, something like that. Obviously, the first few laps are quite boring because he's driving around at the front on his own. But it's not long before he catches the back markers, and then it is a busy race from there on in. So yeah, if you've got a spare 2 hours at any point after listening to this episode, go and find that. But as we say, Prost gave a pretty downbeat interview after this race, despite finishing second and solidifying his championship hopes. Let's have a quick listen to some of the comments Prost made after the race.
It was a difficult race again today. I was a bit lucky, but don't want to care too much about what happened on the front. I just did my race I wanted to do, a bit safe, because there's nothing I could do against a Ferrari today. My chassis was not very good, and I had some bad vibration. It was very tiring. As soon as I wanted to push a bit harder, it was very difficult for me to keep going. The car was able to go quicker, but it was very, very difficult. So, I was quite happy when I saw I was second. It was very difficult to find a motivation before, especially this year with all the problems. And I think it's going to be even more difficult now, because I think I just wet. I think 24 points should be enough. But Ayrton has to win the next 3 races. He's able to do it. But I really think that the Ferrari is able to win at least one race. So I see.
Andy, we talked earlier about the toll this year took on Prost. Have you ever known a driver on the brink of winning a world championship to sound so downbeat?
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it feels completely out of context for where he was in the championship with those ridiculous drop scores. I mean, how complicated were they to try and get your head around? Well, you were 3, so it would have been impossible for you, even with
I had no chance.
All the abacuses in the world.
Even I hated them, though. They were awful.
But yeah, I mean, he was all but there in terms of winning the championship. He had I think the deal had been done to go to Ferrari by this point, and everything seemingly good. Yeah, completely at odds with his demeanour and everything now. Really, but I think that goes to show just how horrible for him personally it was at that point in time. I mean, in this race, you'd struggle to know he was even there. He appears on the highlights for about 30 seconds. You definitely see more of the back markers going round than you do of Prost in this race. It's such a dialed-in performance to a second place. But yeah, and I think, as Sam had mentioned at the top, this fantastic McLaren relationship had all completely run its course at this point in time. And I think, as he would almost have done later on, if he'd just been crowned a champion, he probably would have disappeared and not bothered with the last few races of the season. Things had got to that point by now.
Yeah, he's utterly miserable. But let's end the episode on a positive and another fairy tale story, because we're back with Onyx, because sacking Gasho wasn't the most notable thing about that team from this weekend, because after getting through the hell of pre-qualifying on Friday morning, lead driver Stefan Johansson went without a pit stop to finish 3rd behind Berger and Prost. And I have to say, I totally agree. This must be one of Prost's most anonymous performances. Johansson said Onyx had this strategy in mind from the start of the weekend, and they prepared their race tyres by putting a very gentle heat cycle through them in practice to harden them and make them more durable for Sunday. Then, after making quick progress from 12th on the grid up to 8th, he sat tight and picked up places as other cars pitted or retired. Johansson said by the end of the race, the canvas of the left front tyre was showing. And then, as a sign of how tight everything was, he ran out of fuel on the slowing down lap and missed the majority of the podium ceremony. And he only arrives once Berger and Prost are already spraying the champagne, and he appears through a little doorway that opens. On F1's Beyond the Grid podcast with Tom Clarkson, Johansson said this was probably his most satisfying podium finish of his career, even if he felt he had better drives earlier in more competitive cars where he didn't end up in the top 3. But of Portugal 89, he said so much work went into it. It was such a personal thing for all of us. We'd all had our setbacks, and here we are, a bunch of guys that were good friends. It was an unbelievably tough year with pre-qualifying, and the team was on the brink with no finances. Emotions were high all the time, so it was definitely satisfying. Sam, this was one of 2 times a driver would go from pre-qualifying to finishing on the podium, and it was the first time it happened. How impressive was this whole weekend from Johansson and Onyx?
Oh, incredibly impressive. I mean, what a journey that is from 8 a.m. on a Friday morning until getting onto the podium, or just getting on the podium in Stefan's instance. It was, in my mind, one of Johansson's best F1 drives. He actually should have been on the 3rd row of the grid. He missed a gear in his on his final quick lap in qualifying, and I reckon that he lost at least a second, which would have put him sort of 5th, 6th on the grid. So he started 12th, did a remarkable non-stop run, looking after his good years like they were sort of prize jewels or something, and by the end they seem to be made of stone or something. So a great weekend, a great drive from him for an Onyx to outfox and outrace Williams, Benettons, Brabhams. It was just a brilliant giant killing out, wasn't it? I mean, it was a tantalising glimpse of what might have been achieved had that team been run properly from the commercial ownership side of things. So again, just reiterated earlier, what a shame. And great job by Stefan. And I'm still waiting for my Moneytron dividends. I don't know about you, VDB. Did you ever get yours?
No, but I was just going to add, had he not had a little problem in pre-qualifying and Leto had made it through, which he had the pace to do, he almost certainly would have finished in the points as well, though he was that quick, or what would have been his debut. So it could have been an even more impressive weekend for Onyx. But no, I'll live in hope of my Moneytron payout coming through at some point in time.
Well, that seems like the perfect place to end it for Portugal 89, and lots of mentions for Moneytron as well. So we'll bill them for the promotion, and I'm sure they'll pay very quickly. Plenty of the stories from this weekend did roll into the Spanish Grand Prix at Jerez just 7 days later, so we'll pick all of that up in a future series, I'm sure. Thanks to Andy and Sam for joining us for the long trek all the way back to the first year of our glorious V10 era. Next time, we're taking our first dip into one of our most requested topics from our audience, and that's Alain Prost's F1 team, Prost Grand Prix. And I say first dip because this story will get more than one episode, but we're going to kick things off by revisiting the team's first season in 1997, when Prost took over Ligier on the eve of the campaign and had a very promising first year that it turned out was not a sign of things to come.